On a bright spring afternoon in suburban Melbourne, dozens of schoolchildren looked up and saw something they would never quite agree on. Whatever crossed the sky above Westall in 1966, it left behind a question that still hangs there today. Westall was not a remote desert or a military range, but an ordinary school district of neat streets, playing fields, and low houses. That ordinariness is part of why the case endures. Something extraordinary seemed to break into a very normal place. The incident is usually placed on 6th April 1966 at Westall High School and the nearby primary school in Clayton South. It happened in daylight, in front of students and teachers, which gives the story a rare and unsettling clarity. In the years since, the details have shifted and multiplied, but the core remains simple. Something was seen, something was chased, and something may have landed or moved through the grass. From there, the case opens into a maze of memory, witness, and missing records. Witnesses later described a silent grey object, low and unusual in shape, moving in a way that did not fit the aircraft people expected to see. Some remembered it hovering. Others said it descended toward a paddock beyond the school grounds. What makes Westall hard to dismiss is the number of people who say they saw it at the same time. Schoolyard stories can blur, but a shared sighting among children, staff, and nearby residents gives the event unusual weight. Some accounts place the object near Grange Reserve, where students reportedly ran after it and found flattened grass. That detail matters because it turns a sky sighting into something almost physical, as if the event briefly touched the ground. A few witnesses also recalled a second phase to the story. Vehicles arriving, adults moving quickly, and children being told to keep away from the area. Whether that means official response or simple confusion is still part of the mystery. Then there is the sound or the lack of it. Several people said the object was strangely quiet, which made its presence feel even less like a normal aircraft and more like something operating on another set of rules. The timeline remains slippery because many recollections were recorded years later, after the event had already become local legend. Yet even with that caution, the consistency of certain features keeps pulling investigators back. One of the most compelling details is the age of the witnesses. Children are not always reliable on every point, but they are often precise about what startled them, and their descriptions of shape, motion, and silence recur again and again. Another detail is the location itself, close enough to suburbs, roads, and open fields that an unusual object would have had little room to vanish unnoticed. If it was conventional, it was behaving in a very unconventional way. A third detail is the reported landing area, because flattened grass and disturbed ground are the kind of clues people remember long after the original sighting fades. Even a small physical trace can transform a story from rumor into investigation. A fourth is the way the story seems to split at the edges. Some witnesses remembered a disc, others a cigar shape, and others only a bright, strange object moving too fast or too smoothly for the ordinary sky. And a fifth detail is what happened after the event. Silence, uncertainty, and years of people wondering why so little was publicly clarified. In cases like this, the absence of a clean record can feel almost as important as the sighting itself. Supporters of the extraordinary interpretation point to the number of witnesses, the daylight timing, and the repeated claim that the object behaved unlike any known aircraft. To them, Westall feels less like a campfire tale than a brief encounter with something genuinely unknown. That reading becomes more persuasive when you consider how quickly the event seems to have unfolded. A short, startling incident can leave behind fragmented memories, yet still preserve the central impression that something impossible had just passed through. At the same time, skeptics question how much later retelling shaped the case, especially when a story grows larger every time it is repeated. Memory can sharpen some details and soften others, and Westall has had decades to evolve. They also point to the possibility of a misidentified aircraft, a weather balloon, or some other ordinary object seen under unusual conditions. In a tense moment, distance, angle, and excitement can make a familiar thing seem deeply strange. Yet that explanation has to account for the reported silence, the low flight path, and the sense among multiple witnesses that the object did not simply pass overhead. It is one thing to misread a shape. It is another to feel you watched it break the rules of motion. The strongest claim in the Westall case is not that every detail is perfectly fixed, but that enough independent people remember enough of the same strange sequence to keep the event alive. That shared memory is the heart of the mystery. If something landed or touched down near the reserve, then the question becomes not just what was seen, but what may have been briefly on the ground. That possibility is what gives the flattened grass and hurried movement such lasting power. But the case also sits inside a wider 1960s atmosphere, when Australia, like much of the world, was alive with talk of flying saucers, space-age wonder and Cold War nerves. In that climate, an unusual sight could spread quickly and harden into legend. That wider context does not erase the Westall reports. It simply reminds us how a real event can become wrapped in the language and expectations of its time. The mystery may be older than the legend, but the legend still carries the shape of the original shock. One unresolved question is why so few official traces are easy to find today. If teachers, police, or other authorities were involved, what was recorded, what was lost, and what was never made public? Another is why the story persists so strongly among people who were there. Decades later, some witnesses still speak as if the event happened yesterday, and that kind of emotional certainty is difficult to ignore. Even the disagreements are revealing because they show a case that never settled into one neat version. Instead, Westall remains a cluster of overlapping memories, each one pointing toward the same impossible afternoon. If it was a misidentification, it was a remarkably persistent one. If it was something stranger, then the ordinary world briefly made room for it in front of a school full of children. That is why Westall still matters, not because every claim is settled, but because the central event remains stubbornly alive. A bright afternoon, a strange object, a reserve, and a memory that refuses to close. More than half a century later, the case still asks the same simple question in a very Australian setting. What did those children really see over Westall, and why did it leave such a lasting mark? Maybe the answer was earthly, and maybe it was something that only looked earthly for a few impossible minutes. Either way, Westall remains one of those rare stories where the sky seems to have touched the ground and never fully explained itself. The details will likely keep shifting with each retelling, but the mystery does not depend on perfection. It depends on the uneasy feeling that on that day in 1966, a group of ordinary Australians saw something that still does not sit neatly in the record.